Russell County, Virginia, August 1899. The air hung thick and heavy with the drone of cicadas, a wet blanket of heat that made the very stones sweat. On a cleared patch of land overlooking the rail spur, a man was building something that made no sense. He was not framing walls with pine and chestnut. He was laying a circle of massive, flat-bottomed field stones. A foundation so wide and thick it looked like the base of some forgotten fortification. His name was Hamish MacKenzie, a quiet man with the pale eyes of a northern sky, recently arrived from a place no one here could properly pronounce. The railroad men, taking their midday break in the shade of a poplar, watched him work. They saw a fool. "What in God's name is he building?" asked Silas Blackwood, the section foreman, wiping sweat from his neck with a red bandana. "A grist mill with no creek?" Goodwin Telford, the Norfolk and Western Company doctor, a man of education and stiff collars even in this heat, squinted at the growing ring of stone. He had a reputation for precise diagnosis, both of ailments and of foolishness. "He's building a silo to store his family in, apparently. A stone silo with no farm." Telford had spoken to Mackenzie, had tried to warn him. The man just nodded politely and went back to fitting a 1,000-pound stone into place with nothing but a lever and a deep understanding of balance. "He told me it was his house," a younger rail hand added, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "A tower house, he called it. Said it'd be warmer." This brought a round of dry, dusty laughter. Warmer? A house made of solid rock, the very material that leached heat from a man's bones and held the winter's frost until May? It was madness. Telford shook his head, a gesture of both pity and professional certainty. He walked over to the company agent, who was observing the strange construction with a worried frown. "I've told the man," Telford stated, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I've told him this is structurally and thermally unsound. A hollow stone tower with a fire at the bottom is not a house. It is a chimney shaped like a house. He's building a death trap. At the first chimney fire, a spark will draw up through every floor and ignite their bedding. He'll incinerate his wife and children." The verdict was delivered. The community, which valued practicality above all else, had judged Hamish Mackenzie's project. It was not just strange, it was dangerously, tragically foolish. The quiet Scotsman, however, just kept working, his hammer ringing against stone, a lonely, defiant rhythm against the chorus of mockery. What did this quiet Brock mason from the Scottish Highlands understand about vertical heat and thermal mass that the most educated men in the mountains had missed? This channel is dedicated to uncovering the lost wisdom of pioneers and innovators who solved deadly problems with forgotten genius. Their stories are not just history, they are lessons in physics, engineering, and resilience. If you believe that the past has something vital to teach us, subscribe to our channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single story. We promise to bring you knowledge you can't find anywhere else. Let us know in the comments. What's the most unconventional house you've ever seen? Hamish MacKenzie was not a carpenter. He had not come to America to swing an axe or push a saw. In the old country, in the windswept expanse of Sutherland, he was a mason, but a very specific kind. He was a keeper of an ancient trade, a builder of dry stone brocks, tall, tapering stone towers that had guarded the coastlines against raiders and storms for 2,000 years. He did not think in board feet and saw curves. He thought in heft and balance, in the language of river cobbles, granite lintels, and the interlocking stones that could outlast kings and their kingdoms. His hands, thick and calloused, knew how to read the grain of a rock, how to seat it so its weight became its own anchor, a permanent part of the whole. He had brought his wife, Elspeth, and their two small children, Fiona and Ewan, to the Appalachian Highlands of Virginia for the promise of work. The railroad was carving its way through the mountains, and men who could work were needed. They were given a standard company cabin, a single-room shack of green pine boards and batten strips thrown up in a week. It was a box, nothing more. And in that box, they met their first Appalachian winter. That first winter was a brutal education. It was a cold that felt personal, an active, invasive force. Hamish had known cold in Scotland, a damp, clinging chill that settled in the bones. This was different. This was a dry, sharp, killing cold that found every crack and nail hole. The green lumber of the cabin shrank as it dried, opening up 100 tiny mouths that breathed Arctic air. They stuffed the gaps with rags and mud, but it was never enough. The fire in the small cast-iron stove roared day and night, consuming the wood Hamish cut at a prodigious rate, yet its heat seemed to vanish into the thin walls as quickly as it was generated. The cold laid siege to their lives with a series of small, humiliating defeats. One morning, Elspeth reached for the bar of lye soap on the washstand, and it cracked into 3 brittle pieces in her hand. The metal of the stove contracted so violently in the night that the door would sometimes spring open with a bang like a pistol shot, waking them all in a panic. Every morning, the water bucket beside the stove, no more than 4 feet from the firebox, bore a solid inch of ice. They slept in their coats, huddled together under every blanket they owned, and still, they were never truly warm. Hamish watched his children, their faces pinched and their breath pluming in the air inside their own home, and he felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. The house was failing them. It was a flimsy shield against a relentless enemy. He knew, with the certainty of a man who understood structure, that he could not win this fight on these terms. He could not make this box warmer. He had to build something else entirely. The failure of the standard frontier cabin was not a mystery. It was a simple, brutal equation of physics. The problem wasn't the stove. The problem was the house wrapped around it. The typical company shack, like the one the Mackenzies endured and their neighbors still lived in, was a thermal sieve. It was built of a single layer of 1-inch thick pine boards. Pine has an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of about 125 per inch. A wall with an R value of 1.25 is functionally identical to having no wall at all in the face of a sustained Appalachian winter. Furthermore, the construction method was a disaster of air infiltration. Board and batten construction, designed for speed and economy, was notoriously leaky. As the green wood dried and shrank, gaps opened everywhere. Between the boards, around the single-pane window, under the door. On a windy night, a family like the Wrights, in the cabin next to the Mackenzies' old place, could watch the flame of their lantern flicker and dance in the drafts that swept across the floor. They were essentially living in a well-ventilated crate. The central failure, the one Hamish understood instinctively from his trade, was the complete lack of thermal mass. The small iron stove burned hot and fast. It heated the air inside the cabin quickly, but the air itself holds very little energy. As soon as the fire died down, that warm air leaked out through the 1,000 cracks, and the thin walls radiated their minimal stored heat into the night. The temperature inside would plummet, often dropping 30 degrees in a single hour. This meant the stove had to be fed constantly, an exhausting, never-ending chore. Men like Jebediah Mullins spent half their waking hours cutting, splitting, and hauling wood, not to be warm, but simply to keep from freezing. Their homes were not reservoirs of warmth. They were buckets with holes in the bottom, demanding to be perpetually refilled. For these families, winter was a siege measured in cords of wood, and they were always on the verge of running out. By late August, Hamish's foundation was complete, a perfect circle, 15 feet in diameter, with stone walls 4.5 feet thick at the base. He had spent weeks hauling fieldstone from the surrounding hillsides with a simple stone boat pulled by a rented mule. He chose each stone with a mason's eye, looking for flat faces and solid heart. He was building without mortar, a technique called dry stone, where stones are locked together by friction, gravity, and expert placement. As the walls began to rise, the structure took on its strange final form. It was a tower, tapering, or battering, as he called it, from a 56-inch thickness at the bottom to a 36-inch thickness at the planned height of 15 feet. This batter gave the tower immense stability, an ancient design that shed wind and resisted the ground's frost heave. "It's a damn chimney, I tell you," Silas Blackwood declared to anyone who would listen, watching Hamish hoist a capstone into place with a tripod of timbers and a simple block and tackle. "He's even tapering it like one." Inside the growing stone cylinder, Hamish framed 3 levels of simple loft floors with rough-sawn oak beams set into pockets he'd left in the stonework. The ground floor was for the stove, cooking, and work. The 2 lofts above were for sleeping and living. He left a generous opening in the center of each loft floor for a ladder and for something else, the passage of air. Dr. Telford made it a point to stop by once a week, a self-appointed safety inspector on a mission of mercy. "Mr. MacKenzie," he said, one crisp October afternoon, the walls now shoulder-high, "I must formally ask you to reconsider. This is a column of stone. It will never be warm. It will be a cave, damp and cold. Your children will suffer from consumption before the new year." Hamish paused, wiping his hands on his trousers. He looked at the doctor, his gaze steady. "Stone is only cold if it's empty, doctor. I intend to fill it." He then turned and went back to his work, fitting a smaller stone into a gap, tapping it into place with a sound that was solid and final. The conversation was over. Elspeth watched the tower grow with a mixture of apprehension and deep-seated trust. "It's a queer-looking house, Hamish," she said one evening, standing inside the circle, the stone walls rising around her like a protective embrace. "The neighbors are taking bets on when it will fall down." "It will not fall," he said simply. He ran a hand over the cool, rough surface of the inner wall. "This stone has been here 1,000,000 years. It knows how to stand." He finished the walls in November, just as the first flurries of snow began to drift down from the mountain peaks. He capped the tower with a conical roof of slate tiles he'd split himself, a dark gray cone that gave the structure the look of a fairy tale fortress. In the center of the ground floor, on a hearth of flat soapstone, he installed his cast-iron stove. The stovepipe ran straight up through the central openings in the lofts, a black iron spine passing through the heart of the home, before exiting through the peak of the roof. The tower was complete. It was a solid, windowless cylinder of stone, with only a single heavy oak door and a few small, shuttered openings high on the walls. To the people of Russell County, it was Hamish's folly, a monument to a stubborn fool. To understand why Hamish MacKenzie's stone tower was not a cold, damp cave, but a furnace of comfort, you have to understand 2 fundamental principles of thermal physics: thermal mass and convection. His neighbors saw a house made of cold rock. Hamish saw a battery made of warmable stone. First, thermal mass. This is the ability of a material to absorb, store, and later release heat energy. The thin pine walls of a standard cabin had almost zero thermal mass. They couldn't hold heat. The walls of Hamish's tower, however, were an enormous thermal reservoir. The structure contained an estimated 95 tons of solid fieldstone. A single pound of stone can hold about 0.2 BTUs of energy for every degree Fahrenheit its temperature is raised. A simple calculation shows the staggering potential. To raise the temperature of the entire stone mass by just 1 degree required nearly 40,000 BTUs of energy. When Hamish started a fire in the stove, he wasn't just heating the air, he was pouring heat. thousands upon thousands of BTUs into the very structure of his home. The iron stove radiated heat in all directions. The black stovepipe, running like a heated column up through the center of the tower, radiated heat at every level. This energy was soaked up by the immense mass of the stone walls. The process was slow, but that was the point. Over several hours, the inside surface of the 4-foot-thick walls would warm up, and once warm, they would stay warm. The stone became a massive, gentle radiator. The card stated the walls could hold heat for over 30 hours from a single fire. This meant that even after the fire in the stove had died to embers, the 95 tons of stone surrounding his family would continue to release a steady, even warmth back into the living space all through the night and into the next day. He didn't need a constant roaring fire. He needed only to keep his thermal battery charged. The second principle was convection, amplified by the tower's unique geometry. Convection is the movement of heat through a fluid, in this case air. Hot air is less dense than cold air, and it naturally rises. In a standard, boxy cabin, this effect is minimal and often detrimental. The warmest air pools uselessly against the 10-foot ceiling, while the cold, dense air settles on the floor where people live. Hamish's tower was designed to harness this effect. It was, as Telford had sneered, a chimney. But it was a chimney for living in. The stove on the ground floor heated a column of air. This warm air rose directly up through the openings in the loft floors. It was a controlled, continuous upward flow of warmth. The cool air from the upper levels would fall along the cold outer walls, sink to the ground floor to be heated by the stove, and rise again. This created a gentle, constant circulation of air, a thermal loop that distributed heat to every level of the home. The design was so efficient that it created a temperature gradient. The card specifies the loft could be 18 degrees Celsius warmer than the ground floor. This was by design. The ground floor was for work, a cool but not frigid space. The upper lofts, where the family slept and spent their evenings, were bathed in the warmest air, capturing the full benefit of the rising heat before it was finally exhausted. He had built a machine for moving warmth upwards. That winter arrived not as a gradual decline, but as a sudden, violent assault. In the second week of January, a weather event the old-timers called a Cumberland Plateau orographic event slammed into the mountains. A mass of moist, cold air was forced up the western slopes of the Appalachians, where it dumped its entire payload of snow and ice onto the highlands. 4 feet of snow fell in 4 days. The temperature plunged to 24 degrees below zero, and a relentless 35-mile-per-hour wind scoured the landscape, whipping the snow into a blinding, granular blizzard. For the families in the company shacks, it was a battle for survival. The Wrights' cabin was buried to the eaves in drifting snow. The wind drove ice-cold powder through every crack in their walls. They burned through a week's worth of firewood in 2 days, the stove glowing cherry red, yet Clara Wright said she could still see her breath just 10 feet away from it. The Mullins family woke to find the nails on their interior walls coated in a thick fur of white frost, the cold conducting straight through the wood. Life contracted to the single, desperate task of feeding the fire. Inside the stone tower, life was different. On the first day of the storm, Hamish built a large, hot fire in the stove, loading it with seasoned oak. He kept it burning strong for 6 hours, pouring heat into the stone walls. Then he let it die down to a slow, steady burn. The 95 tons of rock had absorbed the energy. The interior of the tower was silent, still. The 35-mile-per-hour wind howling outside was just a distant whisper. The 4-foot-thick walls were impervious to its force. On the 3rd-floor loft, the warmest part of the house, Elspeth sat at her small loom, the shuttle making its gentle thump-clack in the calm air. The sound was one of peace, of normalcy, impossible in a home where survival was a minute-by-minute struggle. Fiona and Ewan played on a rag rug on the floor, not in coats, but in their simple woolen clothes. On a small shelf near the shuttered opening, a testament to the tower's impossible reality, sat undisturbed a glass jar of Elspeth's orange marmalade. In every other house in the county, preserves had frozen into solid, useless pucks of ice that had to be thawed on the stove. Here, in the gentle, radiant warmth of the loft, the marmalade remained soft and spreadable. It was a small, domestic miracle, proof that they were not just surviving the storm, they were living through it in comfort. On the fourth night of the blizzard, young Fiona woke crying, her hand pressed to the side of her head. It was an earache, sharp and piercing. Elspeth tried warm compresses, but the pain only worsened. By morning, the girl was feverish. There was only one thing to do. Hamish bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned and stepped out into the maelstrom to fetch the doctor. It took Goodwin Telford 2 hours to travel the half-mile to the Mackenzie Tower, a journey that was more crawling than walking. He arrived caked in snow, his beard a solid mass of ice, his medical bag clutched in a numb hand. He was exhausted, angry, and certain he was about to enter a scene of freezing, tragic squalor. He expected to find a family huddled around a smoky fire in a damp, tomb-like cylinder of rock. Hamish pulled open the heavy oak door, and Telford practically fell inside. The ground floor was cool, perhaps 45 degrees, but the air was perfectly still. There was no wind, no draft. The stove was barely idling, a low red glow visible through the grate. "She's on the top loft, Doctor," Hamish said, his voice calm. Telford, shivering, began to climb the first ladder. As he ascended, a strange thing happened. The air grew warmer. He reached the second loft, a space for sleeping, and the temperature was noticeably milder. He could feel the warmth on his frozen cheeks. He climbed the final ladder to the third loft, the living space, and it was like entering a different season. The air was a comfortable, dry 65 degrees. It was warmer than his own well-built office back in the settlement. He saw the child, Fiona, tucked into a bed, and Elspeth beside her. He took out his brass ear trumpet, a device he used for listening to a patient's breathing, but as he raised it, the cold metal instantly fogged over in the warm air. He stood there for a moment, dumbfounded, watching the condensation obscure the polished brass. He set down his bag and took off his heavy, snow-crusted coat. The warmth of the room felt like a physical presence. After a few moments, he found himself shrugging off his suit jacket as well, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. He, Goodwin Telford, was working in his shirt sleeves in the middle of a historic blizzard. Inside a stone tower he had declared a fatal absurdity. While he examined Fiona's ear, his eyes took in the scene. He saw the loom, the children's toys, the quiet domesticity. He saw the jar of marmalade on the sill, its contents gleaming softly in the lantern light. He reached out and touched the inner stone wall. He expected the biting cold of rock. He felt instead a steady, persistent, radiating warmth, as if he were touching the flank of a large, sleeping animal. The stone was alive with stored heat. He finished his examination. A simple infection, easily treated. As he packed his bag, he looked at Hamish, his face a mixture of awe and professional humiliation. All his education, all his certainty, had been wrong. This quiet, unlettered mason had not built a chimney. He had not built a tomb. Telford looked at the warm stone, at the comfortable family, at the jar of spreadable marmalade, and tried to find the words. "You didn't build a house," he said, his voice quiet with revelation. "You built a lighthouse for warmth." Goodwin Telford was a man of science, and when presented with irrefutable evidence, he did not cling to his prior beliefs. He became the tower's most vocal and influential advocate. he wrote a detailed 7-page report to the Norfolk and Western head office in Roanoke. He described the construction, the physics as he now understood them, and his own personal experience during the Great Blizzard. He didn't use romantic language. He used the cold, hard calculus of the railroad: fuel efficiency, worker health, and operational readiness. The standard company dwelling, he wrote, is inadequate for housing personnel in high elevation sections during severe winter conditions. It results in illness, low morale, and an excessive expenditure on firewood, which must be hauled up the line at considerable cost. Mr. Mackenzie's tower design, while unconventional, represents a profound improvement. It is in effect a permanent, habitable, winter caretaker shelter that can maintain a livable temperature with a fraction of the fuel. The railroad, an entity that cared little for tradition and a great deal for numbers, was convinced. The idea of section houses that could be kept warm for days on a single fire, ensuring their crews were fit and ready to clear the tracks after a storm, was deeply appealing. That spring, the company commissioned Hamish MacKenzie to oversee the construction of 3 more stone towers on the Pocahontas Division, at the highest and most weather-beaten points on the line. By the autumn of 1900, his strange, ancient design had become official company policy for mountain shelters. The mockery had lasted a single season. The validation was being built in stone. What Hamish MacKenzie accomplished in the Virginia Highlands was not an invention, but a brilliant act of translation. He took ancient knowledge born of the wind-lashed coasts of Scotland and applied it to a new landscape with an old problem. In doing so, he anticipated the core principles of modern building science by nearly a century. Today, we have names for what he did. His massive heat-absorbing wall is a form of trombe wall, a key element in passive solar design that uses thermal mass to store the sun's energy, or in his case, the stoves. His understanding of air circulation prefigured the science of the passive house, which uses controlled ventilation and heat recovery to maintain comfort with minimal energy input. He was building a high-performance home 100 years before the term existed, using nothing but stone, gravity, and a deep, intuitive grasp of physics. There is a profound lesson in the stone tower of Hamish MacKenzie, a closing thought on the nature of shelter. He did not try to build a stronger wall to hold the cold at bay. He understood that the mountain winter was an elemental force, too powerful to be defeated by simple fortification. A thicker pine wall would have failed. A bigger stove would have only burned more wood. His solution was more elegant, a reframing of the entire problem. He didn't shelter his family against the cold. He hoisted them above where cold could reach. The deadliest cold. The damp, drafty air pooled on the ground. By building vertically and channeling his heat upward, he created a new stratum of existence, a warm, livable space 15 feet above the frozen earth. It was a strategy of elevation, not opposition. He wasn't fighting the mountain. He was using its own stone to build a perch of warmth and safety within it. A quiet defiance that proved the most enduring solutions come not from brute force, but from a quiet understanding of the world as it is. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If this story of ingenuity and resilience resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of forgotten wisdom. We believe these lessons are more important than ever. In the comments below, tell us, have you ever seen a building that uses thermal mass or natural convection in a clever way? We'd love to hear about it. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative purposes. However, the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and thermal physics. Any application of these or similar building techniques in a modern context should be undertaken in compliance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and professional engineering standards. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.